moving into detention and deportation, the first thing that I want to note, with a little bit of background, is that the use of detention and deportation are not new. As we know, last year we saw record levels of detention. We concluded 2016 with over 40,000 people detained. During the Obama administration, 2.5 million immigrants were deported. So these are not new tools or new tactics, right? And from those experiences, we have seen that part of what comes with detention and deportation are some really negative impacts, including family separation, psychological, emotional impacts, both for those that are detained as well as for family members. And then also access to protections for asylum seekers, for those that come seeking asylum. And I wanted to, if I can find it here, just share with you briefly about a story about the impacts, the psychosocial impacts of detention and deportation. And this comes from a report before the Inter-American Human Rights Court, in which Boston College was involved. And it says, Julia, a Guatemalan indigenous Mayan woman, was detained in a raid at a Massachusetts factory where she was manufacturing backpacks for US soldiers in Iraq. Julia's 2-year-old son was with a babysitter when his mother was detained. He was waiting by the windowsill, as was his habit, for his mother on the day she did not return from work. Julia was transported to a Texas detention center. She was prohibited from placing a phone call to her family for the first few days there. She pleaded with immigration officials. Her son had asthma, a condition for which he had previously been hospitalized, and the babysitter didn't know how to operate his oxygen machine. Julia recalled that she was threatened by immigration officials that her children would be taken from her if she continued to ask for quote-unquote special treatment, and was informed that her processing could take anywhere from 1 month to 1 year to complete. Julia was separated from her son for 9 days during her detention. According to Julia, the raid and resulting separation precipitated her son's tantrums and nightmares, difficulty sleeping, eating, and speaking, and extreme separation anxiety. So, this is one story that I wanted to share just because it gives some of the specifics of what this actually looks like for families that are separated through detention and deportation. In this case, it was a 9-day separation, but we know that these separations can really vary, and some of them are longer term when they result in deportation. So, and that story I would notice was from 2013. So again, these are not new approaches. We can learn from them and some of the negative impacts that we have already seen as we move forward, and as we hear that these approaches will not only be continued, but that the current administration is really looking to increase them and expand them significantly. So let me talk a little bit about the policy side at present, and the 2 recent executive orders from President Trump, as well as some memos that were released from the Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Kelly, regarding the implementation of those memos, of the implementation of the orders. So the orders were regarding border security and interior enforcement, and they were released at the end of January, as you might recall. Some of the components that these orders include are an increase in the use of detention, significantly expanding who would be so-called priorities, or who would be targeted for detention and deportation. A limited use of prosecutorial discretion, I'll talk a little bit more about that. An increase in the use of expedited removal. And another piece that's in there is the return of non-citizens to contiguous territories. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So just to highlight a bit some of our concerns around these components and really what they could mean, and that we already are starting to see some of the meaning behind them. On the use of detention, we know that it is that it is costly to detain people, but as the story that I shared really demonstrates, and I think more importantly, the psychological and emotional toll that it has on people is really quite great. And I see somebody shared the report. Thank you for doing that. And concerning. So we're concerned about those impacts. We're concerned about the separation of families. And in particular, when we have seen that there are alternatives to detention that can be just as effective and that are less traumatizing, that where we can avoid some of these adverse impacts. In terms of expanding those who can be detained and deported, one of the things that the executive order mentions is that it includes those who not only have been convicted of a crime, but also can include those who have been charged or those who are deemed a threat to public safety or to national security. So we're concerned by this in conjunction with the limitation of prosecutorial discretion, which prosecutorial discretion basically means that DHS has the authority to determine the extent to which they will enforce immigration laws, and that has been in place as a way of helping DHS to use its limited resources and limited time more effectively. And so under the Obama administration, there were certain priorities for immigration enforcement to make more effective use of those resources. So these orders really limit the use of that, and we're concerned that by expanding so far those who will be targeted for deportation and detention, and by not exercising this prosecutorial discretion, that people can be targeted for very, very minor crimes, and sometimes that crime might just be having immigrated. So I think we're already starting to see this. A few weeks ago, was in February, you may have seen that Kino Border Initiative received a woman by the name of Guadalupe Garcia de Barrios. She and her family lived in Arizona, and Guadalupe was arrested in Phoenix when she went to her semi-annual check-in to request permission to remain in the U.S. With ICE in Phoenix. And so this is an example of a woman who previously would have been able to stay in the U.S., was deported to Nogales, and it demonstrates the family separation that we can see. She has 2 U.S. citizen children who remain in Arizona, and this deportation has impacts for Guadalupe and of course for her family as well. Want to mention that, and then another component of these orders and of the memos regarding their implementation is the expanded use of expedited removals. So this basically says that individuals can be removed without going before an immigration judge or having an immigration hearing. And instead, it basically gives that power of determination on deportation to ICE officers. So previously, this was the case. This was in effect within 100 miles of a U.S. border, and for those individuals within 2 weeks of arrival. And now it's been significantly expanded to geographically to anywhere in the United States, and to 2 years versus 2 weeks. And so those individuals have to in some way be able to prove that they've had continuous presence within the United States for those 2 years. So again, this is something where we can learn from policy that has already been in place and that has had adverse effects. We already have been concerned that there are people fleeing violence who have been wrongfully detained with expedited removals and who haven't had due process and fair consideration of asylum claims because they haven't had the necessary the time to put together the necessary legal evidence and to access legal counsel. But we're concerned that with this vast expansion, that it will increase the vulnerability of many more people, and that it will also affect people who are not new arrivals, who are actually integrated into our communities. Chris, how are we doing on time?
We're doing okay.
Shall we move forward?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so sorry, I just want to add one last point on that, which is that although we are focusing on some of the impacts of detention and deportation here in the US, I want to note that when these individuals are returned to home countries, and some of them, for example, to Central America, Mexico, and places that are struggling with levels of violence right now, that further complicates the situation, and that in the long run, it may not be helping us to, of course it's not helping to return individuals to violent situations, where those situations will become further complex and we'll have more and more people fleeing situations of violence. So in terms of the asks that we would encourage you to put out there and contact your elected officials on, really the main ask is oppose the detrimental effects of detention and deportation on families and communities, all those effects that we've just talked about. So specifically what that looks like is opposing the expansion of these expedited removals. As we've already talked about, it can sometimes lead to the wrongful deportation of people fleeing violence. And we're concerned about this expansion and the impact that it will have, particularly on individuals who may be well established and contributing to our contributing members of our communities. Secondly, we ask that Congress not approve additional funding to expand detention bed space, but rather invest in alternatives to detention. So again, here we know about the toll psychologically, emotionally, that detention can have on people, and we want to avoid that and instead use more cost-effective and healthier alternatives to detention that are community-based. And yeah, we'll leave that there. And then finally, we want to ask that family unity be respected and preserved as ICE determines whether to deport or detain. So this is the story of Guadalupe, right? Strengthening the family is a core value of our faith, and parents shouldn't be torn away from their US citizen children. Similarly, Central American minors shouldn't be discouraged from staying with their parents in the US as they seek asylum. This is a component that we didn't speak quite as much about, but that was also included in the guidance for the executive orders in terms of unaccompanied minors only being considered unaccompanied minors for up till a certain point in their case. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions.
One question was related to best practices for those who are undocumented and have been in the U.S. more than 2 years to be able to demonstrate their continuous present to enforcement agents. So how would that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would really suggest contacting an immigration legal a professional, either attorney or accredited representative on it for the legal advice portion of it. But you know, and they really, I think, based on their experience of trying to help individuals access immigration benefits, are experts in creativity and coming up with ways to demonstrate this. Sometimes it's through bills or leases. There's a variety of different types of documentation that can be used in immigration cases. And so they really would be able to provide the best guidance on that.
Great. And another question was from Mary Beth. She asked, for those of us who work with corporations, do you have any ideas on how U.S. corporations can be engaged to stand in solidarity with immigrants or with those they employ? Are there ways they can resist raids or take other steps to support their employees who are immigrants in the face of the executive orders?
That's a really good question. You know, I think that we already are starting to see some of this through, for example, the Day Without Immigrants. We saw some, I know, here anyway, some employers who either closed or limited their hours because they wanted to show solidarity with their immigrant workers. In terms of resisting raids, I think that's a little bit more challenging. DHS issued some guidance in 2011 around certain sensitive locations where immigration enforcement agents shouldn't be entering except for in exceptional circumstances. Corporations and businesses aren't going to be among those. I think this is a really good question, and it's one that I would be happy to follow up on and see if there are other suggestions on ways that businesses can be in solidarity with their immigrant employees.